Foreign Policy Association. Here in week 2, our attention turns to the topic of war crimes. For most of us, war crimes reminds us of what happened after World War II at Nuremberg, when high-ranking Nazi and German officials were held accountable for the violations of the laws of warfare. 4 major powers, the victors of World War II, the United States, the Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and France, joined together for the prosecution of alleged Nazi war criminals. Once the process in Europe was underway, attention focused on the Pacific, with holding Japanese politicians and military officials accountable. In Tokyo, there were 11 judges, some of them with clear conflicts of interest, and also there was the shadow of Douglas MacArthur, who played an instrumental role in revising the direction of this tribunal and even changing some of the final outcomes of the judge's decisions. Today, we think of war crimes as we look at the unfolding war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion, the occupational behavior, the weaponry used on the battlefield. The evidence is being collected for possible war crimes prosecution once things settle down in Europe. Historically speaking, World War II was certainly a high point. We had the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals. We also had the spin-off trials, the Dachau trials, the doctors' trials, the generals' trials, the kidnappers' trials, and many, many others. A large number of individuals were successfully prosecuted. Most of them were found guilty of what they were charged with. Before that, there was an effort after World War I to also hold the Germans accountable for starting that catastrophic conflict. In fact, in 1919, we handed over to the German government a list of 1,000 Germans who we believed had committed war crimes, and we wanted them turned over to an international tribunal. This became highly problematic as our interests were equally divided. On the one hand, we did want to hold the Germans accountable individually and collectively for starting the war, but on the other, we had a vested interest in keeping the new German government together. And the thinking was that if we forced them to hand over so many German citizens, the government may lose legitimacy at home, it may collapse, and before you know it, Bolsheviks are running roughshod in Germany. So the decision was made to allow the Germans to prosecute their own citizens. We gave them the docket, we provided the evidence, and at the end of the day, those 1,000 individuals suddenly became only 12 that made it to court. 6 of them were found guilty, and the sentences were extraordinarily light. So a very bad precedent was set after World War I. That was clearly remediated in 1945 when the victorious powers took over prosecution. The Cold War that followed was one with very few international war crimes prosecutions. The handful that did take place occurred domestically. Once the Cold War ended, however, we have an incredible increase in both the interest in and the activity of international tribunals. A tribunal for Yugoslavia was created by the UN Security Council, followed by one for Rwanda. And then at the end of the decade, in 1998, at Rome, a statute for the International Criminal Court was created. Today, we have 3 main considerations before considering U.S. foreign policy options as it relates to war crimes. We begin with the concept itself. We look at the legal institutions that adjudicate, and then finally we briefly consider the track record of holding individuals accountable. We start with the concept of war crimes. What are they and where do they come from? ILOAC is the International Law of Armed Conflict. We can simply call it the laws of warfare or the laws of armed conflict. Where do these laws come from and what are they? Well, the categories are threefold. There's jus ad bellum in the Latin, which is the legal right to go to war. This is determined by the major powers of the world at any time in world history. There's jus in bello, which is the behavior in time of war, the weapons that are deployed, targeting practices, and the like. And then finally, the newest of the 3 categories is jus post bellum, which is responsibility to make things right once the war is over. We begin with jus ad bellum, the competence de guerre of states. means the right of any nation to go to war. From the onset of modern world politics until the end of World War II, there were very few limitations on the right of a nation state to go to war. A sovereign nation state could simply go to war for most any reason that it determined, with one exception that dates back to 1648. That's when the 30 Years' War concluded. The major powers of Europe decided that religious differences were no longer a legitimate recourse or right to go to war. And then suddenly in 1945, perhaps because of the devastation of World War II or the use of atomic bombs, more likely because of American leadership, the right to go to war was greatly reduced. This was an American decision, and it was etched into the Charter of the United Nations in 1945. So what exactly does the Charter say? It says nation states shall not, in their relations with other states, either use or threaten to use armed force in their international relations, with the following exceptions. Since 1945, a nation may legally go to war if it is acting in self-defense, meaning it has been attacked, if it is acting in collective self-defense, which is coming to the rescue of a victim state. Think about the United States in 1950 and rescuing South Korea, or should the Security Council approve of an international conflict, which happened also in 1950, a bit after the intervention began. If a nation state commits a violation of the laws of armed conflict, it is then responsible for those violations. It isn't to say that a nation state will pay any price for breaking the rules, but it is to say that option is available. Jus in bello is a little more refined. It's much older in its evolution because it dates back to biblical times. There are 4 key limiting principles that apply to every nation state's military on the battlefield. The first is distinction in targeting. It's a simple matter. You may target the military of another side. You may not target civilians or non-military assets. Belligerence versus non-belligerence is the dividing line. There's a ban on weapons that cause unnecessary or superfluous injury. The purpose of a weapon is to take out another soldier, either through killing or injuring to the point that they can no longer continue the fight. There are weapons designed to cause unnecessary levels of suffering beyond that which the soldier would be able to continue. Tumbling bullets are an example. They enter the body. They're designed in such a flawed way that when they touch a bone, they begin to tumble and they move around the body, destroying organs, muscles, and other vital, life-necessary components of the body. Principle number 3 is called proportionality. They used to say in graduate school that you can't kill a mosquito with a sledgehammer to demonstrate the rule of proportionality. What this means is you can use enough force legally to win the war, but you shouldn't overdo it. You don't continue to destroy the enemy after the battle, after the war is over. And then finally, there's an international prohibition on perfidy. Perfidy is difficult to explain on some levels because it's unfairness in warfare. It's exploiting the trust of the other side. For example, if we were to enter enemy lines with a Red Cross symbol, we're making the opposition think that we're doctors and nurses there to help them as neutral actors, and in reality we're transporting armed troops or weaponry across boundaries, or pretending to be a priest in warfare. Priests may not be targeted, so we dress up as a priest so we avoid targeting, and that gives us an unfair advantage on the other side. Soldiers in professional militaries today are not really trained in Hague and Geneva law. They normally don't speak Latin and understand the intricacies that are laid down in the laws, but they are professionally trained. And in that training, they understand concepts such as honor and code. That honor and code reflects the laws of armed conflict and those jus in bello principles. So where did these laws come from? Ancient religious writings, I mentioned the Bible earlier. Philosophers, military elite have played a critically important role in defining the laws that apply to their soldiers, statespersons, and diplomats that negotiate these rules with other nation states. If we consider the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 as the first truly modern, comprehensive view of the laws of war, Geneva of 1949, those four conventions are the most modern application. And what we find is that military field manuals of professional militaries reflect the principles laid down at Hague and Geneva, and therefore have a great influence on soldiers on the battlefield. We now turn our attention to legal institutions. If there is a war crimes trial, overwhelmingly, 99% of the time, it happens in domestic courts, not in international tribunals. The Eichmann trial of 1961, the author of The Final Solution, who was captured in Argentina by the Israelis, taken back to Israel and prosecuted quite publicly. He was the man in the glass box for his own safety. That happened in a domestic court. The same goes for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of the architects of 9/11, held in the United States and prosecuted by American courts. International tribunals do exist. Historically, they've been ad hoc or temporary for a particular purpose. That was Nuremberg and Tokyo, Bosnia and Rwanda tribunals, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, Liberia, among many, many others. Tribunals created for a specific purpose, even at times for a specific individual, and then once that trial is over, those tribunals shut down. On the permanent side, we have only the International Criminal Court. Technically, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, can prosecute a nation state for violating the laws of warfare, but it's much more likely that such a prosecution would happen in the ICC. The impact of these tribunals on the development of international laws of armed conflict is important because Yugoslavia and Rwanda were created in the 90s at a time when the old Geneva law was not very specific. It was exceptional for training manuals, but it was too vague for a court of law. So those two tribunals provided amazing levels of specificity, creating delineations, definitions, outlining exactly where the laws end and where the new set of laws begin. So their impact on the laws was remarkable. By the time the International Criminal Court in The Hague began to function, the laws were ready for the courtroom, and it simply took them in new directions. Our policy towards the International Criminal Court evolved in interesting ways. The senior George Bush, shortly after the war in Iraq ended in 1991, went to the United Nations General Assembly and proposed the creation of a permanent international court, a court that could hold individuals accountable. He was obviously thinking of Saddam Hussein. Then the United States refused to ratify the treaty nearly a decade later when it was complete. The Clinton administration left that for its successor, but it did sign the document on the way out of the White House in 2001. The younger Bush administration, W., then promptly unsigned the same document, which is the legal equivalent of unringing a bell or unspilling milk. Something's happened, you've signed, you can't really go back and erase your signature. So what we effectively did was announce to the world that we're not going to implement the ICC protocol and we're not going to submit it for Senate ratification. And then we went to war with the ICC. Not long after George W. Bush said, we're not going to join, but we're not going to undermine, we sought to undermine the court in every way possible, drafting domestic laws that precluded the U.S. from any assistance in ICC prosecution. And what that means is we're not going to turn over evidence. Or if we have alleged war criminals in our jail system, military, of course, we're not going to hand them over for prosecution. And a part of that law, the APSA, was a provision that allowed the U.S. president to use any means necessary to rescue an American in ICC detention. The ICC is located in the Netherlands, which is a fellow NATO member, so the critics referred to this document as the Invade the Netherlands Act. Finally, we consider the track record of prosecuting alleged war criminals. Here we have the three basic categories of individuals involved in armed conflict: soldiers in the field, military command, and then the head of state. During World War II's prosecutions, Nuremberg and Tokyo, this graph was expanded dramatically. Newspaper editors, industrial elites, politicians at lower levels were all indicted and held accountable for their support of the Nazi regime and its goals in World War II. But today, for most trials, the individuals come from these three categories. War crimes allegations are overwhelmingly found at the field level. And naturally so. This is where soldiers commit acts that may not be legal. They can use weaponry that is deemed outside the bounds of legal acceptability. And I'll give you an example of how the rules are drafted and how difficult they can be to apply. Consider the serrated knife. A serrated knife, which has the edges near the handle, is perfectly legal. It's a tool and it is a weapon. If it's used as a tool to cut cloth or rope or a tree branch, it's perfectly legal. But the moment that it is used as a weapon, it becomes a violation of the laws of war because those serrated edges cause superfluous injury to the targeted individual. It's no different than a blade that is on one's hip. That's perfectly legal because blades are a necessary weapon of war. But according to the laws, if you attach it to the end of a rifle, it's now illegal as a bayonet because of the superfluous injury rule. So it's at the base level, the field level, the soldier level, that most war crimes allegations are made. They can be at low levels or high levels, and occasionally members of military command are accused of committing war crimes, as are heads of state. Heads of state have been prosecuted after World War II, at Tokyo in particular, but also in some of the ad hoc tribunals of the 1990s and beyond. If it's at the head of state level, it's probably the allegation of an illegal invasion. Vladimir Putin is vulnerable to that charge today. If it's at the military command level, orders to violate the laws of war. If it's about bringing to trial, then suddenly our graph changes because overwhelmingly it is going to be people on the ground level, the soldiers in the field committing acts that are deemed to be illegal. In terms of convictions, our space gets much smaller. Very few individuals are successfully prosecuted for breaking the laws of warfare. As noted earlier, 99% of all trials are done at the domestic level, and usually it is the national or military court of the individual being prosecuted. And so they tend to go out of their way to understand the situation on the ground, to give the soldier every benefit of the doubt. The prosecution rate is remarkably low. Even when the evidence is overwhelming, thousands of pictures of torment, of torture at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq following the 2003 American invasion really didn't move the dial very much. A small handful of ground-level American soldiers were prosecuted successfully for violating the laws of war, but no one at the military command or higher level. Keeping in mind that when you read the memoirs of George W. Bush, he openly acknowledges that he approved of enhanced interrogation techniques, which is a very long-winded way of saying torture, because we define these actions as torture before Iraq and we do so afterwards. We can't simply make an exception when it is convenient for us when these pictures hit the newsstands. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022 brought this topic to great decisions level this year. The invasion was significant. In early days, it looked overwhelming. The tide of the war changed very quickly, and the behavior became more and more prohibited on the Russian side. So let's take a look at Russia's war crime record in Ukraine. The invasion was clearly illegal. Ukraine did not attack Russia. It certainly did not invade Russia. There was no self-defense, no collective self-defense, and there was not a Security Council authorization. Commission of war crimes is widespread. The evidence is overwhelming. There's clear evidence that crimes against humanity have occurred. The difference between a war crime and a crime against humanity is that the latter is a pattern of systematic violation of the former. So one war crime in and of itself is adjudicatable. If it happens over and over as part of a systematic process, that means it's a crime against humanity. The laws of belligerent occupation have been violated, and there's an enormous tab that's coming due for the Russians once this war is finally over, the post-conflict destruction or use post-bellum. What will happen to Vladimir Putin once this war ends? It's quite possible that he will never be held accountable. He will remain in power like most leaders have. The vast majority of state leaders that have authorized an illegal invasion have not paid a legal price for it. There could be a domestic response. Perhaps the Russians get tired of Vladimir Putin in office, pursuing this war of folly, of great economic and physical pain for the Russian population. They could use the war crimes allegation as an excuse to remove him from power, pushing him out and holding him accountable. There's also the possibility of an international tribunal being constructed specifically for this conflict, or the International Criminal Court being used. An example here is Slobodan Milosevic. He was the most powerful force in Yugoslavia throughout the 1990s. He oversaw the disintegration of Yugoslavia, the invasion of Croatia, the invasion of Bosnia, and then in 1999, the war in Kosovo. He was seemingly out of reach until his own political allies decided he's too much luggage for them. They would rather get rid of him. And so they ushered him into a waiting automobile and they shipped him off to The Hague, Netherlands for prosecution. And there you can see him as defiant as ever during his own prosecution, but certainly reduced in terms of his impact, in terms of his aura, in terms of his reputation. He died before the verdict was issued. We now turn to U.S. foreign policy options, and in so doing, we have some nested issues. There is Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine, the broader issue of the International Criminal Court, and then finally the week 2 great decision of war crimes. We'll look at these in order, beginning with Russia. Holding Russia accountable for its violations is somewhat important, particularly the jus post bellum, the destruction of the state of Ukraine. By estimates as of November the 8th, the day that this video was filmed, the tab has already surpassed $1 trillion in damage. And there really is not an end in sight for this conflict, nor for the amount of destruction that Russia is causing. Let's look at war outcomes and Kremlin politics. If this war ends in territorial compromise, as Henry Kissinger and many other realists have argued, there's a very real possibility that Vladimir Putin would stay in power. He would spin it in such a way that this was a successful war. It won't be true, of course, but it may be just enough to keep him in power. If the war ends with Russia losing all of its territorial gains, and that would be Crimea, as well as the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, it would be very hard for Vladimir Putin to stay in power. This would be a clear war failure. It would be very hard to spin in any other way, and that could make him vulnerable, much more so than the territorial compromise option for war crimes prosecutions. If it turns out that the Western world wants Russia to truly pay for its invasion of Ukraine, and by that I mean not only losing all of the Ukrainian territory that it controls, but also, for example, Abkhazia in northwestern Georgia, making the Russians pay economically into the foreseeable future, then it's very, very difficult for Russia to maintain its leadership position. I mean, Putin would have to be out. There would have to be a transition of power, and that makes the likelihood of a war crimes prosecution for Putin even greater. Looking at the International Criminal Court, it's interesting to watch how Americans debate this, especially U.S. senators. On one side of the spectrum, usually Democrats, there's an argument that we have a moral obligation to join the International Criminal Court. That's not true. And then on the more conservative Republican side, they view the ICC as a threat to the United States, which also isn't true. The real issue is the debate in between. Where do we find the cost-benefit analysis? Is it in the U.S. favor? There are costs to joining the ICC, and there are benefits. The costs are not as high as the ICC being a threat, nor are the benefits as high as American moral global leadership. They're much more technical and specific, and that is the area that no one debates, certainly not elected politicians. In the Senate, of course, they're responsible for ratifying the document, should it be submitted. So it's a bit of a hollow debate that happens in the U.S. relating to the ICC, and for that reason, the likelihood that we will join in the coming, say, quarter of a century is amazingly low. And finally, we look at the topic of war crimes, our great decisions this week. I'd like to frame this in a broader perspective. If this graph represents all of the treaties, the customs, and the principles that make up Hague and Geneva law, which of course is the laws of armed conflict, it is premised upon global ordering principles that the United States holds near and dear. A stable global order is one without warfare, certainly not illegal or impermissible warfare, and nations should behave in professional manners on the battlefield. All of that leads to a global system that is quite secure and prosperous, which promotes American interests, both domestically and abroad. If we look at war crimes and war crimes allegations as assaults on our nation, as undermining our security and our interests, what we're really doing is punching holes in the very global ordering principles that we've relied upon now for more than 75 years. And that, of course, will call into question any promotion of American security and prosperity. So when we think about war crimes, it's not really a technical issue. Was that knife legal or illegal? Was that intervention on this side or that side of the laws of warfare? This is really a discussion of American global leadership and the model of global security and prosperity that we designed after World War II. Article 2, Paragraph 4, that's the prohibition on warfare with its exceptions. 1950 Korea was an exception. 1990 Gulf War was an exception. The Security Council authorized a rescue of those victim nations. 1999 Kosovo, that weakens Article 2, Paragraph 4, as did 2003 Iraq and 2011 Libya. On the other side, the Russian Federation has committed 3 violations as well. 2008 is Georgia, 14 is Crimea, and 2022, of course, was the whole of Ukraine. But of all of these violations, the 2 that stand out as most damaging to the American-designed rule system after World War II is 2014 and 22, because these weren't political statements. These weren't efforts to simply change leadership. This was territorial integrity that was undermined. The Russians took the sovereign territory of Ukraine in 2014, and they attempted to do the same thing again in 2022. When these violations occur, we must stand on principle and resist. It was a mistake in 2014 to allow Moscow to get away with Crimea. The world did respond in 2022, forcing Russia to pay a very high price for that illegal invasion. Thinking big picture, war crimes really are about global peace, stability, and American leadership. Thank you as always for joining me.
Near the end of World War II, Americans firebombed Tokyo using a chemical precursor to napalm. We firebombed and killed somewhere close to 300,000 Tokyo civilians, non-combatants, women, children, no soldiers. That attack was led by General Curtis LeMay. LeMay was assisted by a colonel on his staff who did a detailed mathematical analysis of the optimum speed of the bombers, the optimum height of the bombers, and the way that the bombs should be dropped to maximize their effectiveness and the ability of fires that the bombs created to merge with each other and cause more destruction. That colonel was Robert McNamara, who would go on to contribute to American military history further during the Vietnam era. LeMay at the time commented to a U.S. war correspondent and said, paraphrasing, if we lose this war, I'm going to be prosecuted as a war criminal. Near the end of World War II in Europe, the Royal Air Force firebombed Dresden, which had no military significance at all, killed a few 100,000 people, ruined beautiful architecture that had stood for centuries. The person responsible for that attack was an RAF general nicknamed Bomber Harris. And after the firebombing of Dresden, Harris said to a British correspondent, if we don't win this war, I'm going to be prosecuted as a war criminal, which leads to the question of, are war criminals only on the losing side and not the winning side? To make it more personal for us, we have the case of Lieutenant William Calley in Vietnam. Calley's company killed hundreds of innocent Vietnamese, women, children, old men, and he was in fact prosecuted. He was convicted of a war crime, although no one in his chain of command, by the way, was prosecuted. He was. And he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to house arrest for a while. And then he was given a presidential pardon. Lieutenant Calley is still alive. His job these days is selling jewelry in a jewelry store. Did we really, in fact, respond to the war crime that Calley, without question, committed? With those tidbits as preface, let us look at questions 1 and 2 on page 28. By the way, Mark Lundberg, you should start warming up because I'm going to be calling on you first, so I'm not surprising you when I do so. Question 1, what is more important, the establishment of an international law code or the preservation of state sovereignty? If there's an international organization that can say to Russia, you violated the rules of war and you need to turn over your soldiers, or you need to turn over Vladimir Putin because he approved war crimes. If that's appropriate, then the ICC should have the authority to say to the United States, we want you to turn over the commanders in Guantanamo who have been torturing Muslims for a couple of decades down there. Those are war crimes. And we want you to turn over your commanders. How does that sound? How does that feel? If it's good one way, it's good the other way. So we run into the concept of international law code versus state sovereignty. The other question, number 2, are rulings by international courts valuable even if they have no enforcement mechanisms of their own? ICC has issued a warrant for Putin's arrest. Does that actually accomplish anything? That is the second part of what we are going to discuss. Mark, you can take this any direction you want to. We will go back and forth based upon my other discussions on this, but I would appreciate if you would lead off, Mark.
There
you go.
I would be happy to. In watching the video and then reading that whole question about state sovereignty versus adherence to an international court, you can think of so many examples. You brought up Lieutenant Calley. To a lesser extent, you could probably find similar, and Abu Ghraib was another one, but there are probably other ones additionally. You could probably find some issues in the 20 years we were in Afghanistan too. So, within all of that, you've got a thicket of occurrences that could be labeled war crimes of sorts. Now, is there going to need to be a consensus at the international level on what's going to constitute a war crime? And of course, the professor, went through and labeled all of those things And I think, at least for most of the civilized world, what Putin has done in Ukraine can be easily viewed by people as being a war crime in terms of the aggression, et cetera. And then, what's the totality of that? So I certainly understand why the United States has been reticent about getting into and signing off on many of these international bodies because of the fear that, again, politics could come into play. Or if we had some of the things that we have done internationally could also be construed and then labeled as a war crime of some sort, you're getting into a real thicket of things. So I think it's a real tough call, but I certainly understand the degree to which the United States wants to hold off on signing onto many of these things. That's why I think maybe special tribunals might be the more appropriate mechanism for some of these things. But anyway, those are some of my initial thoughts on this.
The U.S. is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, nor is Russia, nor is China, nor is India. Arguably, 4 of the strongest countries in the world have all decided for their own reasons that that's really not an organization they want to sign to, align to, rather, not assign, align to. Okay. Terry Weber, I would like to, oh, never mind, Terry, you've got like a 15-second reprieve. You have time to get your thoughts organized because Bob has saved you. So Robert, you go ahead.
I think maybe a bit more forcefully than Mark, I would say we probably, if we're going to lead, we more or less built the new international order. If we're going to continue to lead in that, I think, we can't have rules for thee and none for me. I just don't see a way forward for us to, the one thing that I continually see critiques of America is, hey, your hypocrisy of, you make rules for everybody else, but then you conveniently forget them. And that only serves to weaken us. And I'm not sure, I don't know the, all the intricacies of, Abu Ghraib, but I don't know who are we really benefiting. How are we benefiting by protecting those soldiers at Abu Ghraib? As a country, like, are they strategically, strong soldiers that, boy, we wouldn't want to lose them to a criminal court for torturing enemy combatants. I don't see how that's a win for us, and the damage that it does to our name and standing and the entire idea of an international rule system, I think vastly outweighs anything that we benefit from.
In some of my groups, Terry, I'm going to speak for a minute and I'll go to you. In some of my groups, I have retired military. I'm talking about generals and colonels who invested 20, 30 years of their lives in the US military. And this chapter made them angry. And it made them angry because they said, and I'm going to generalize and summarize their comments. They said, we as American military retired are angry that the few people, Calley being the obvious example, who committed war crimes were not fully prosecuted. They tell me about the annual training they have to go through, about the rules of war, the morals of war, as bizarre as that sounds, the rules that they're supposed to follow. And they said, it is obvious to us that Calley and more recently, the people in charge of Abu Ghraib did not follow the rules that we were taught to follow. They need to be punished. Where is our moral high ground if they do not suffer punishment? I had one retired colonel go off for about a 20-minute tangent. It was almost like therapy for him because he was so angry that we have not, in fact, acted the way we should for our own folks who clearly broke the rules of war like that. Terry, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that. And having military in my family, understand those feelings. And And understanding that, let's see, question one, state sovereignty is the legal right and responsibility of a state to govern itself in political affairs, so that a foreign country can't come in and trounce over them. And international law code is trying to get at what our military friends are saying, that there are rules of engagement. There are rules of engagement in business. There are rules of engagement in war. And when they're not followed, there should be repercussions and accountability. And when we don't follow those rules, we don't follow the repercussions, then all sorts of bad feelings come into place. And so I get that, and I understand that. I want to be respectful, but personally, I thought it was a stupid question. I think both of them are needed together in order to balance the world. But the rulings by that international court that I think is important to have the code in parallel with state sovereignty. Is it valuable even if they have no enforcement mechanisms? And, it's a tough, sticky wicket, but in my opinion, at least it's making the gesture of accountability. Sometimes it's successful, but even though hope is not a strategy, as we're taught in business school, the hope is at best maybe rulings like and/or arrest warrants, like have been done by the ICC, may prompt other countries to take notice, and maybe they will stop future agreements with the country of issue, in this case, Russia. Maybe they'll question the validity of current agreements, depending, if applicable, what's going on with Russia, and possibly worst case place sanctions on that country, even though we know sanctions don't always work. I think the best thing that could come out of it is awareness and countries starting looking at their own relationship and revenues, business agreements that are going back and forth with the country that is breaking the rules.
Hope is not a strategy. Very good. Yeah, no, it is not. No. Rex.
First, a question. Is Israel a signatory?
No.
Okay, and that's understandable because they're, considered a pariah to the whole Muslim world and much of the rest of the world. So they would be decimated if they submitted to that. And I think to some extent, we've seen that there is an anti-US bias in parts of the country, of the world as well, that would be pushing for us to be held accountable. But I'm wondering if, like in the Abu Ghraib situation, it wasn't particularly soldiers that were doing the interrogations, it was the CIA. And so that's, hands off, you don't touch the spy world or whatever. So, I think that there's another thing there. And it was tacitly authorized at the head of state level. And so that changed what our people's rules of war were, or rules of engagement, for that time frame. And so I think to hold those people accountable, when Bush said he authorized enhanced interrogation, now he didn't delineate that waterboarding was in, but naked non-sleeping time was not in. He didn't try to spell out which were and which weren't. And so could there have been some that were outside of the pale? And then maybe there is something, but we have our own court-martial system for people who violate that. And there have been people who have committed atrocities in Iraq or Afghanistan where they killed innocent civilians, and they've been prosecuted. So, we do, at least to some extent, try to police that.
Rex brings up an interesting point in that in those comments that he made. The CIA was indeed involved, but there are horrific pictures, and I suspect many of you have seen them, of US soldiers making fun of hooded, manacled, naked Muslim men unnecessarily while they are absolutely defenseless. Someone approved that and or allowed it to occur. And if we take the CIA and put it to the side for a minute, that's a chain of command issue that we should have been active in going after, and sadly, we did not. It's hard to take the moral high ground if we are not willing to say to our own people, you broke the law, sorry, you're going to be prosecuted. It's tough to do that. We need to be consistent, and that's not our hallmark on this topic. Bill and Jamie. Unmute, Bill.
Sorry, they talk about when there's laws in effect, like the death penalty, et cetera, does that deter crime? And there's all kinds of different things, reactions to that, and all different kinds of answers to that. Now, how does anything by the international crimes deter any type of war? Do you think any country that's going to go to war is going to be thinking about the repercussions that are going to come afterwards? I think not. But that's one thing. The second thing I was just thinking about, what would happen if Putin came to the United States? He could not be sent to the Netherlands, could he? Since the United States is not part of the International Court Commission.
Criminal court. Technically, Bill, you're correct.
Yeah. What about the first question, the first thought? How does it deter anything? Can anyone give any thought that it could deter?
Let me, Bob, hold on for a second. Referring again to my retired military folks who've been through this chapter with me. Another point that they made was that in the American military, it is stressed that you should refuse an illegal order. If you're given an order which is illegal, shoot that pregnant woman, to be extreme, right? You have the right to say no. Now we know that that includes a risk of condemnation, court-martial, etc. But they tell me that that is part of the annual training, which is you decline an illegal order. So there's some accountability there that should be applied to our military, other militaries, etc. Just because Putin says, I want you to go do this, soldiers have a right. And remember, that goes all the way back to Nuremberg, where initially some of the German officers who were on trial said, well, they were only following orders, and that was determined to be an insufficient defense. Following orders, when they are clearly an illegal order, is not the defense. And my retired military folks tell me that's part of the annual training or reminders that they go through.
Gary?
Yes, Bill.
I question that a little bit. How do they know that pregnant woman was really pregnant? How do they know she wasn't something else? I come back to a thought that I had when I was at University of Michigan. I applied for NROTC. I wanted to get into the Navy ROTC at the time.
Right.
And I was interviewed by the local colonel from the Marine Corps, and he said, "Let me give you a supposition. What would happen if you were in an airplane and you were going over clearly a hospital or someplace where there are going to be all kinds of civilians? What would you do if they gave you an order to bomb that?" And I thought to myself, if I say I'm not going to follow orders, I can say goodbye to the NROTC. So I said, and I think it's true, I said, I would have to assume that the people above me know more than I do, and it's a fake, and it's not really a hospital, or it's not really civilians. And I became an ensign in the Navy.
Okay. It's fraught with peril, Bill, because if a soldier says, I refuse to follow that illegal order, are they going to be court-martialed? Are they going to be shot? Are they going to be arrested? Or in your case, are you not going to have a successful military semi-career? You know, I understand that. But that's what they told me, is that's what the training says. And that flies against what those German officers said at the beginning of Nuremberg, which was, I just following orders, I'm innocent. No, if the order is illegal, then you are not innocent. It's a, I don't know, sticky wicket. I think somebody said wicket earlier in the conversation, but in this case, the wicket is incredibly sticky. Bob, go.
Yeah, I think the question of whether or not any laws by the International Criminal Court will deter or force people to act justly or something, I don't think it will. I'm not going to deny that, but I think it's important to at least have penalties for failure to follow the rules. You know, just because, yeah, I don't know, stealing doesn't stop crime. It's still good to have penalties for stealing. The question is, what's a just penalty for that? And that's something we can debate and have arguments back and forth about where the right penalty is for breaking a law is. But I wouldn't, just because it doesn't deter crime, it doesn't really feel wouldn't deter war crimes or wouldn't make everybody suddenly just in war. I don't think that's a reason to vote against it.
If we don't define what is unacceptable, then in fact, we accept anything. Even if we can't enforce it, we have to at least define it. This is not acceptable. Today, maybe I cannot do anything about it, but if I don't define it, then in essence, what I'm saying is, whatever you do, it's okay. And morally, that goes to a really, really negative place. Really negative. Hi, Henry, go ahead.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Something that, that's been bugging me since I read this, and you just made the point for me and didn't really realize you were doing it.
You're welcome.
I thought so. We have to learn how to define what a Wagner group is. We talk about soldiers fighting for a country, and we don't talk about people who are professional killers that are involved in these kind of affairs. And of course, the article didn't mention it. And it's just bothering me as you said, we have to define that maybe there is a point where we don't go in and hire paid killers to go on and fight our battles. So that to me was lacking in the article. The article didn't even think about going outside what is a soldier. We haven't even been able to define what that is, yet alone maybe what a Wagner group is. I'm off my soapbox.
The Wagner group is a group of mercenaries.
Yeah.
The parallel in the United States would be Blackwater.
Okay.
A group of mercenaries. Blackwater hopefully does not recruit from prisons, although the Wagner group does recruit from prisons. But either way, Henry, they're mercenaries, but they are following orders, and they should be subject to whatever the laws of engagement are that apply. My knowledge of the Wagner group over the last 6 months or so, as I've gained more of it, is truly disgusting in terms of what they do, how they recruit folks, etc. They're mercenaries, I understand that part. But, taking folks out of prison who already are a little bit antisocial, perhaps, and putting them in the battlefield with big weapons, that's not going well. Rex, go. Rex, unmute.
So if the International Criminal Court does say issue an arrest warrant for Putin, and if the Russian Supreme Court says we will try him, does that satisfy the international rules?
No.
Was that a trick question, Rex?
No, because we could do the same thing for the officers at Abu Ghraib or at any of our other places, is we say, okay, we'll put them under, house arrest and try them in a court martial or whatever is appropriate.
Okay. I don't really have a disagreement with you. I have a point to make, but Mark's hand is up, so let's go to Mark first. Mark.
So I was just looking at question number 2 about whether those court rulings are valuable to some extent. It seems like most of the world doesn't view these as being highly enforceable. But I think they do have a lot of value because it is just another, I guess you could go to the UN and make a speech against Russia and do those kinds of things. But when you have a court of law saying these things are wrong that they are doing, I think that carries, and again, maybe it's the moral weight behind it. But I think also, if you look at the way all of these international legal institutions have evolved, going back to the beginning of the 20th century and obviously through Nuremberg and all the others, there is a body of law out there. There is some international institutions now that try to address these things and won't be deterred simply because they can't get a conviction. At least I hope as much. So I think going through the exercise, yeah, you would like to get a conviction of Putin, but is it more important to just simply get it out there that most of the world views what he did as being reprehensible? If you could pull Xi aside and ask him what he really thought, he probably thinks the same thing, but he's a politician and he's looking at how best to play this for his country as a whole. And I think the moral issue for him is a heck of a lot less because he's trying to consider his whole country and what that means for them internationally. Nevertheless, it's hard to imagine many people saying absolutely he's got an unmitigated right to do all of this stuff, totally believe everything he said about the Nazis in Ukraine and all that other stuff. I mean, you could probably count the number of people like that on the head of a pin.
Are you challenging the mathematical computation of how many angels can you put on a mark? I didn't know what direction you were going there.
Well, I just think that the number of countries or people around the world who think that his base argument of why he invaded Ukraine is going to be a very, very small number of people. That's what I'm saying there. His
Okay,
rationale.
agreed. Let me do a bit of a historical reference because I think it's relevant at this point. Putin's population is receiving a very edited view of the news. Putin controls the media in Russia. I mean, some people I'm sure can get some media feeds from outside the country, but essentially he controls the media feed. And his approval ratings are high. Yes, some young men have fled the country because they don't want to fight. But overall, the rural population, and Russia has a lot of rural population. They have literally two cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg. They have a rural population, and they're very much in support of Putin because he tells them, we're rescuing the Russians in Ukraine. Ukraine is led by a bunch of Nazis. They attacked us first, blah, blah, blah. What's missing in this, and it's a reminder of how lucky we are to have freedom of speech. Go back to 1968 for a minute with me. And remember when Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam for 2 weeks. And at the end of the 2 weeks, he made a broadcast where he said, you know what? We're losing this war. Our government has lied to us. We shouldn't be here. And we should now move towards peace. It helped destroy Johnson's presidency, along with, Senator Eugene McCarthy. It helped destroy Johnson's presidency. We didn't exactly promptly do the right thing because then we went through Nixon. Okay. But that's freedom of the press. That's a wonderful thing. And at the moment in Russia, those folks don't have it. At some point in the future, I hope Russian people will become aware to some degree that, hey, our president received an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. What's that about? Will that change anything? Don't know. Hope it does. Freedom of the press cannot be overestimated. Cannot. Bill and Jamie, go. Bill, you're still muted.
Sorry, sorry. I want to say first of all about sovereignty versus international law. I don't think there's a versus. We need both. Yeah, we can be sovereign and we can also have international law. International law is not trying to make the laws of the country. They're trying to keep people safe from the criminals who are doing terrible things, and that's separate. But I also think that, right, the ICCs in many countries are now involved in that, probably more than have been before in other of these types of international law or criminal behavior courts. Maybe we can't just forget about international law. Maybe if it grows, the world will become more aware of it and it will become something that will have teeth. It doesn't have teeth really right now, but maybe it will become stronger if people agree that it's important to have international law. That's all.
The pinch point, Janie, is when an international law decision, International Criminal Court as an example, says to a country, you acted inappropriately and we need to have you provide to us these people who were integral to these illegal behaviors so they can be tried at the ICC. Is that something that we as a country, or any country for that matter, are willing to say we are surrendering some of our sovereignty to allow our citizens to go on trial to an international court? I'm not saying good or bad. I'm simply saying that's the issue. We need to think through that because in essence, it is an argument against sovereignty. Those of you who are veterans of great decisions will remember about 4 years ago or so, we had a chapter about the International Criminal Court specifically. And one of the speakers in that video was John Bolton. And Bolton made a very strong declarative statement that said, as a US citizen, I don't recognize any sovereignty above the Constitution of the United States. Therefore, I'm not going to support the ICC. His view, whether you agree or not, I suspect would be echoed in many other countries. And that is the issue. Theoretically, we should all be able to say, you know, these people behave badly, et cetera, but sovereignty is going to rear its head and it is going to get in the way. It's frustrating. I just think it will. Israel, go.
I believe the answer to number 2 is that it's important that a decision like this was handed down by the International Criminal Court about Putin because it serves notice. It serves notice that Putin has committed a crime. And everyone in the world now is aware that if you do this, it's illegal. You can't do this. So far, he's only been charged with abducting children. That's what this charge is for, right? Abducting children, taking them to the Soviet Union.
Yes.
But it now clearly defines that as illegal. You can't do that. As more charges are filed, that serves notice that those are illegal. So I think it serves an important function. Secondly, we're talking about sovereignty, national sovereignty.
Right.
Someone in the United States commits a crime, an international crime. They get charged by the International Crime Court. It's a trial. They're on trial now. They have a chance to defend themselves. It's a trial. They're not guilty before the trial. They go to trial, and then the trial determines whether or not they committed a crime. So I don't have a problem with it. I don't believe that national sovereignty is more important than international. I don't. I think if you commit a crime that the world court says you've committed a crime, you should stand trial for it.
You are a principled person, Israel.
Well, you're on
You're-
trial, Gary. You're not
No,
convicted.
Israel, I'm being totally serious. You are. The issue then becomes, and it happened under the last administration, where we put sanctions against some of the judges of the International Criminal Court because we thought they were giving unfair rulings to some of our allies. Oh, for goodness sake. By the way, we will get to talk about sanctions when we get to chapter 4 in a couple of months. That's an interesting conversation, but we're not there today. I agree with you, Israel. I'm just saying that your position is probably a minority position, but I agree with you.
Thank you.
Of course, I think you and I are probably used to being in the minority, so hey. It's
There's
not-
some truth. There's some truth to that.
Yeah, okay. Is there value in saying to someone, you're on trial, there's an arrest warrant for you, even though we all know that Putin is never going to go to the ICC? Is there a value? Let's see if we can wrap up that part of the conversation. Does it make sense to do that? I need someone to respond to my question there. Thank you, Bob. Go.
Yeah, I think, there's no way to undo the horrors of war or any crime. There's no way to undo that or even to ever make it whole. I mean, even if they arrested Putin and, I don't know, hung him, let's say, did the whole trial and everything, I don't think that will make people whole. That said, saying even to the extent possible, there is an arrest warrant for you, you need to answer for these allegations. It's something, it's not perfect, but in the absence of perfect, I think it's a good place to start, to at least have a body to be able to say, in a very sober and controlled setting of a judicial court, I'm assuming most of them are professionals. They think there's at least enough cause that you should come here, even against your free will, to answer for what you're being charged for. I think that's valuable, even if it doesn't lead to anything or whatnot.
If you research the World Court and the judges who are currently on it, because it's a rotating sort of basis, they all have incredible, I'm going to use the word pedigree, that may not be the right term, but they all have incredible pedigrees in their nations in terms of where they have served law school, years of service, etc. These are folks who are experienced jurists. I think that is a safe statement to say. Mark, go.
Yeah, this is not directly on that topic, but a point of fact, and Gary, if you could address these. I couldn't remember, Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein. Did Gaddafi ever go to trial? And Hussein, was he tried in an Iraqi court?
Gaddafi never went to trial. Hussein was tried inside of Iraq at a court that pretty much we convened.
Okay.
Neither one went to the ICC. No. Bill, Janie.
I keep coming back to something. This is not a question, it's just a comment. We're talking about this and it seems so out in left field compared to when you think about what's going on in the United States. Does Trump, and I keep coming back to Trump being charged.
Bill, you just used the T word, Bill.
Yeah?
That's not in the chapter, Bill.
Okay,
We have no shortage of polarization in this country, Bill, but the T word is not in this chapter. So with all due respect, my friend, we're going to go past that. And we're going to go to Liz now, who has her hand up. Liz.
Okay, so the question was, what good does the international court arrest warrant on Putin do? And it does make him an international pariah. It's a major blow to his esteem, Russia's esteem. It does restrict Putin's travel. He can go
Yes.
to China, he can go to well, he went to someplace in Ukraine, which was sort of the middle finger salute to the rest of the world, I think.
Yes.
And, it does here, the Human Rights Watch called the ICC decision a wake-up call to others committing abuses or covering them up. So it does have some international impact. You're not going to get somebody in jail, but it does create, what can I say, motivational, yeah, prestige issues.
Okay, I'm going to build on what Liz just said. This afternoon, I was out in Huntley at the Huntley Library leading their Great Decisions group on Chapter 2. And someone in that group made the interesting statement that said, we talk about what happened at Nuremberg, but most of the adults who were alive when Nuremberg was taking place have left the scene. And what the ICC is doing, what Ukraine is doing by bringing up these allegations of war crimes, is to remind a younger generation that, what, this behavior is continuing, and let's put it in your face because it's happening now. This is not a historical footnote. This is now. So it reminds younger folks, compared to the Nuremberg generation, reminds them that war crimes are awful and need to be examined and prosecuted. Therefore, it makes it worthwhile. I mean, we amateur historians like myself, I know Nuremberg, many of you probably do, but there's a whole lot of folks in this country who are, big surprise, hold on, younger than us, who don't necessarily know about that the way that we might. It's good for them to know that. Hi, Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, I have two comments. One is, I just don't understand why the largest country in the world needs more territory. So that baffles me completely, why Putin, who has the largest amount of land, wants more land. So I don't think it's a territorial dispute, and I kind of object to them trying to say that it was a territorial dispute, in the video, but that's one part. The other thing is about war criminals. If somebody doesn't eventually pay that for their crimes, then what we're saying is that person's above the law, and that all the laws apply to the rest of us, but not that guy. And I think there's something wrong with that theory, and we shouldn't let it be the case. Just like with the president, they're saying, well, you can't charge a president while he's in office. Well, if you can't charge him while he's in and you can't charge him after he's out, then he's above the law. He's exempt. So you have to be able to charge him one or the other. And the same thing with war criminals. If you don't.
You muted yourself, Karen, inadvertently you muted yourself. There you go.
So you got to charge them somehow.
Agreed. They need to be charged. It needs to be public. It needs to be part of the record. Absolutely agree. Terry, I think I saw your hand there, Terry. Unmute.
Nope, you didn't.
There. I thought Bill brought up an interesting point. What about a person who commits genocide within their own country? Like Hitler with the Jews in the Holocaust, where shouldn't those people also be brought before the criminal court, the International Criminal Court?
The criminal court was formed essentially in the 21st century, so it wasn't around at that point. But the folks who did that certainly should be held accountable. And Terry brings up an interesting point. I could make a case, though I'm not going to, we only have 13 minutes left. I could make a case that there are war crimes going on at the moment in 3 countries in the world. We have China's treatment of the Uyghurs in Western China. We have Myanmar's treatment of the Rohingya in Myanmar. And we have India going after Muslims in the northwest corner of their country. And I could make a case that all three of those are war crimes, but they're within countries. And going back to the sovereignty issue, does that mean that the country's behavior is beyond international jurisdiction? Probably so, but there are war crimes going on in those three cases besides Ukraine. Ukraine is the more classic one side attacks, one side defense sort of thing. But there are war crimes going on in those places as well at the moment. Israel.
I believe genocide is considered a war crime. It doesn't differentiate if it's done internally and a nation destroying a population inside the country itself, or if it's exported and they're taking out another people from even in another place. But genocide is part of the war crimes. My question, Gary, was I believe I read somewhere or heard somewhere that 120 nations are part of the ICC. Am I correct?
Rough numbers, that's close. Yeah.
120 nations.
But the US, China, Russia, India are not.
Yeah, the superpowers are not part of it.
Right.
Yeah. But the rest of the world is.
Meaning like 2/3 of the world. Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
And that makes sense because the smaller and less powerful nations in the world look to the ICC for some degree of protection. The larger, more powerful nations go, we don't need that. We can defend ourselves. So it's not surprising, but unfortunately it's true. Question 3, by the way, just for the purpose of completeness, I'm on page 28. Question 3 reads, Russia's veto power on the UN Security Council allows it to avoid any actions against its leaders. Is it time to restructure international organizations such as the UN? Spoiler alert, the UN isn't going to change its definition of itself. Sorry, none of the members of the Security Council are going to give up veto power or say, okay, I want to step off. That's not going to happen. It's not going to be redesigned. I'm sorry. We are stuck with the UN as it is. It's not going to change. The UN serves a purpose. It's great on international relief. Got an earthquake, here comes the UN. Yay. But in terms of anything meaningful, such as getting involved in the war in Ukraine, not going to happen because of veto power. The UN has a role, but it doesn't help in this particular conversation. It just doesn't. Sorry. It just doesn't. There's a conversational lull, folks. This is where one of you steps in now. I can speak for 90 minutes, but this is a discussion group. Come on now. Thank you, Rob. Go ahead.
So I guess the reason I know maybe I'm on the support international law more than maybe others. But the reason I look at it is, when I think about the history of Rome, one of the big things for Rome in its earliest stages was establishing law. Prior to really getting law to establish how we settle disputes and, who, you offended my neighbor, you offended my brother or whatever, and now I'm going to kill your uncle. That was what it was. It was essentially, you just got a bunch of families together and you fought it out. It was, not great. And by transitioning to law, you wind up taking that vendetta system to the extent you can out of the people and saying, fine, I'm going to leave it to the courts to, execute my vendetta for me. And, I worry, the reason I tend to support the more international, more robust in that sense is that it allows us to remove the, to the extent it will over time, build to where people say, no, we're not going to counter strike. this is where the international court takes over. But that would require a much more robust system than we have right now. You know, our court systems don't just have, you know, the ability to write strongly worded letters and politely ask you to come to the court, you know, to court for a criminal case.
Yeah, it would not be a polite invitation, Rob. Yeah. Okay, Bill and Janie.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment about the United Nations and the Security Council and Russia having or all of them actually having veto power, but Russia using it way rest of us don't like it. And some people say what the United Nations or the Security Council is useless. I don't think it's useless even so, even though it's not accomplishing what we would like it to accomplish. At least they're talking, they're bringing things to the fore, or educating people about the issues, and maybe there's some good help from it, and in some way.
I hope so. I do. I do. Let's go back to Nuremberg for just a minute. We talked about that a few minutes ago. In Nuremberg, the victors held the losers accountable. The losers obviously committed atrocities. That's not even up for discussion. But I want to point out something that was valuable from Nuremberg, and it may have a future correlation with the International Criminal Court. First of all, the defendants at Nuremberg initially said, well, I'm not guilty because I was following orders, and the judges struck that down and said that's not a defense. And after that, then the German people had the opportunity to observe in granular detail the atrocities committed by their political leaders. The ability for them to say, I didn't know, I wasn't aware, dissipated, because now they knew and now they were aware. That catalyst helped contribute to the growth of Germany, which is now a fully functional democracy, an ally of the United States. If you had said in 1946, if we had all been there, is Germany going to be a democracy and our ally in the 21st century? I doubt if anyone would have said yes. But it was, it is, pardon me, it is. And I believe firmly that part of it was because of the effect of the Nuremberg trials. So if the ICC goes on and actually tries Putin and his cabinet minister, the lady who's responsible for managing the movement of all of these kids from Ukraine into Russia, if they go ahead and have that, that will be public record. And eventually, I hope, at some point, the Russian people will become aware of that. That may improve their understanding of the sort of government that they're willing to allow to take place. Rex.
I hope you're right about that, but the big difference is that the German press could pick up on that, whereas the Russian press is controlled, and so Putin's never going to let that happen there. Now it will filter in to some extent as the truth about what's going on in Ukraine is filtering in to some extent, but whether or not it can reach a critical mass that the population says, ooh, this guy's really bad and we're not going to vote for him the next time, not likely to happen.
That's not the point.
Thank you for smashing my optimism, Rex. I do appreciate your verbal contribution. I was trying to put a little dose in there, but okay.
Putin's not a, what did you say?
Yes. Okay. We're at 7:57. If one person has a particular comment about something they circled or underlined in the chapter, now is your chance to raise your hand and bring our attention to it. Otherwise, I'm going to do a brief preview of chapter 3. Looking for a raised hand. Israel has a raised hand. Go, Israel.
I thought this chapter was really good on teaching us the background of how we came to this point with war crimes, and the people who were most influential about it. In the 1940s, it was Molotov from Russia, who was one of the founders of this whole concept of war crimes, and then the way we got here and all the people that were important in the development of all this to get us to this point. I understand that most of the majority of superpowers are not part of it, but I think it's important. And I think the fact now that they've made a ruling on the war in the Ukraine, I think it just shows the need for something like this. So I thought it was really good to get all this background and find out about how this came to be.
It's a very educational chapter, Israel. I would agree with you on that. It is. Yeah, the role of the Russians back, a few decades ago. Yes, absolutely interesting to me as well. Okay, it's 7:56. So let me do a bit of a preview for chapter 3, which we will get to next month. The title of the chapter is China and America. When you read the chapter, here's the question that I want you to ask yourselves. What can we cooperate with China? Where are the areas of cooperation? Given the fact that we don't trust each other, given the fact that we don't believe the motives of the other, where can we cooperate? Because if we can't find more areas to cooperate, the probability of us going to war, whether it's Taiwan, South China Sea, some variation of that, increases rapidly. Now, I understand it takes two to have an agreement. I understand that. But we need to try to identify some stuff that we might be able to do with China. If we can't, we have an escalating problem that's not going to be good for world peace. So that's what I want you to think about when you read chapter 3. Jamie, we are at the end of this session. Thank you, as always, to everyone for joining us today. Those of you who are more verbal and those of you who just wanted to listen, I appreciate that too, because we all learn when we go through these discussions. We will
Thanks,
see.
Gary. Yeah, thanks. This was great. And my follow-up email will likely come out tomorrow or Thursday. Again, that will have the recording and the information about the April U.S. Supreme Court Justices program that we will be holding virtually. And if you guys have any questions, it is best to reply to my emails that come out instead of calling the main line for the library. That's the best way to get in contact with me. All right. Well, you guys have a good night.
Okay, thanks, everybody. See you next month. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks, Gary.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.